Welcome to this session, The DNA of Cities, Decoding Urban Identity. I'm Andrew Carter, I'm the Chief Executive of the Centre for Cities. Our speaker for this session is Professor Greg Clark. Greg has worked with more than 300 cities over a 30-year career, providing thought leadership on strategy and positioning, as well as advising on the investment and enterprise opportunities associated with an urbanizing world. Greg holds several positions, including Global Head of Future Cities and New Industries at HSBC. He's chairman of the Business of Cities, a research group based at the University College London, a global fellow at Brookings Institution and at the Urban Land Institute. He's also the chairman of the Investment and Programmes Committee at Transport for London and chairman of the Connected Places Catapult in the UK. Greg is sharing his thoughts today with us in a personal capacity and is ideally placed to talk about cities past, present, and future. Greg, over to you.
Well, Andrew, thank you very much indeed, and welcome to all of our audience around the world. Welcome from the Museum of London. As I shall say later on, this is a rather interesting place to be doing this. So we're living in the 5th decade of the century of the city, and I think it's possible to be overwhelmed by the many different ways in which we're able to compare, contrast, catalogue, and assess our cities. We like to do this. We assess them. We create rankings, ratings, league tables, and much more. I should know. Our team at the Business of Cities keeps the single largest and most comprehensive database of city rankings, city indexes, and city benchmarks anywhere. And we've now started to augment that with real-time data, with social media scrapings, and with news exposure. We've even generated an ELO algorithm that enables us to compare any city with any other city. And we also are able to find pairings and groups of cities that seem to behave in similar ways and to do similar things. The larger the cohort of cities, the greater the generation of data, the more it's possible to compare and contrast and understand why and how cities perform. Now, to illustrate this, let me make a little story to begin with, Andrew. 5 years ago, I went to Oslo for the first time. And when I arrived in Oslo, they asked me the question repeatedly, what does Oslo need to do to be as good as Copenhagen and Stockholm and Helsinki? In fact, when I looked at the data about Oslo and I asked the question, which cities is Oslo most like? The answer was not Copenhagen and Stockholm and Helsinki. It was, in fact, San Diego, Tel Aviv, and Brisbane. And I said to the people in Oslo, why don't you stop comparing yourselves to these old, established Nordic capitals and instead start to think of yourselves as a pioneering young city with a great new cycle of development ahead of you and with a different kind of edge? Now, this was quite a risky thing to do, Andrew, and I nearly got drummed out of town. But 5 years later, Oslo has developed a new positioning, calling themselves a young, pioneering city where the best is yet to come. And so this way of comparing and contrasting and grouping cities turned out to be really rather useful. Now, it's endlessly fascinating to do this, and it helps us to create, I think, useful frameworks for measuring change, for tracking progress, for spotting momentum, and also for noting decline. And on another day, I'll give the presentation about why cities are seen to decline and what the data shows us about what goes wrong with cities that appear to have lots of promise. Now, I think we know much more today than we knew even 10 years ago about how cities work, how they perform. And we've started to develop a kind of new science of cities that all of us are involved with. This is evident in the economic, in the geophysical, the demographic, the spatial, the financial, the reputational, and all the service satisfaction data that exists out there. Our ability to compare cities, their systems, their situations, and their symptoms across multiple jurisdictions is almost unbound. And for many of us, this has created a new kind of medicine of the city. If you like, there's diagnosis, there's treatment, there's pharmacology, and some people might even be seen to have emerged as sort of doctors to cities, if you want to put it that way. Now, as I've been thinking about this over the last period of time, and trying to observe, in a sense, how our understanding of cities has emerged, I've had one of those moments where one is caused to pause and reflect. Time literally stood still for me for a few moments about 6 months ago. Time kind of caught up with me. And I realized that I've been working on cities for 30 years. And much to my surprise, I started to count the number of cities that I've visited. 31 in the UK and the Republic of Ireland, 68 in the wider Europe, 30 in Latin America, 5 in the Caribbean, 6 in Canada, 48 in the USA, 9 in Africa, 13 in the Middle East, 7 in India, 3 in Russia, 44 cities in China, 17 cities in ASEAN, 19 in Australia and New Zealand. And suddenly I realized, Andrew, I visited 300 cities. Now, this was quite a startling revelation for me because I realized that having studied and reviewed 300 cities over the past 30 years, I began to wonder not just what have I learned, but why have I done that? Why have I done that? And the answers don't really come too fast, but I've been pondering on this. And 3 real answers have sort of emerged as things that I find interesting. The first is this: that for those of us who are really interested in cities, we are living in a very lucky time. This 5th decade of the century of the city is the time when the process of urbanization is at its most extreme. More than 600 cities growing rapidly around the world. The world's population shifting from 1980 to 2080, 40% of 6 billion people in 1980 to 80% of 9.5 billion people in 2080 living in cities. And all of the inventions, the technologies, the new industries of our time are aligned with this process of urbanization. And of course, urbanization and urban knowledge are evolving somehow together. As the city evolves, our understanding of the city evolves. And new knowledge and understanding is being created all of the time. So for those of us who are fascinated by cities, this is the best time to be alive. Secondly, it's very clear that this process of urbanization is tied up with the great challenges of our time as well. The challenges of climate change, the challenges of health, the challenges of inequality, innovation, productivity, and security. These are all bound up with our cities and how they evolve. It's endlessly fascinating to see how the concentrations of human beings in these shared spaces that have these systems and services that support them add another dynamic to the way that we address the grand challenges of the modern world. So it's an important time to be interested in cities as well. And then the third explanation, if you like, for why is that I simply can't help myself. Some of this is a kind of addiction that gets worse the more you do it. The more cities you visit, the more cities you want to visit. And there's part of me that is really compelled to visit cities, to get to know them. I don't know quite why this is, but the pull is very strong. Let's just say that I love the smell of cities, and I'll come back to that later on. Whether your view is that the greatest inventions in the world have come from cities, or if you think that cities themselves are humankind's greatest invention, there's a draw to understand the magic of cities and the chemical formula that underpins it. So my personal view is that why this is so compelling about cities, or what is so compelling about them, is their sheer ability to synchronize the activities of very, very large numbers of people through the systems and services that they provide. I think that's astounding. The tumult of common purpose that cities organize for us is a wonder to behold. Now, shortly, I'm going to start talking about some new work that we've been doing. We asked more than 100 people around the world what was the greatest inventions of their cities, and how many of them simply said that the city itself was the greatest invention they'd ever seen, began to surprise us a lot. So my self-confessed addiction to cities has now become a source of inspiration. and I've started to ponder what that is all about. Working with my colleague Caitlin Morrissey, and on reflection, this addiction comes from a very startling but very obvious observation. Each city is unique. Now, saying each city is unique is rather obvious, but it's a much bigger statement than I first thought. Of course, each city is unique, but have you stopped to think about how cities are unique? And not just how cities are unique, but how is the uniqueness of each city to be perceived, to be understood, to be leveraged, and to be utilized? This is the question that I'm now consumed with. So we've developed, as it were, a new way of trying to think about cities, to move beyond the idea that the comparison of cities is important and that indexing and ranking and comparing and producing different kinds of benchmarks is key. And we've become consumed not so much by the outside in story of cities, but by the inside out story of every city. It's fascinating to hold these two different perspectives at the same time. What does the world on the one hand think about our city? And on the other hand, what does our city tell us if you read it correctly? We're constantly choosing between these two different ways of thinking about cities, and yet we haven't really developed a clear science for articulating what the inside out is. So we've begun to develop this new complementary stream of work, which we call the DNA of cities. There will be a book, there'll be a podcast series that will come out soon. We've interviewed more than 100 people, and we've selected 12 cities that we want to study in an initial phase of work. Some of the world's experts gave us very clear analysis of what they think the DNA of cities is, their discipline and how they understand it. But it's combined with remarkably different perspectives from different kinds of people. Some people spoke to us about the ecology of the city. Others talked, of course, about the geography, the history, and the chemistry of the city. People spoke to us about the anthropology and the social biography of the city. Many people spoke about the mathematics and the geometry of cities, what defines their shape, their size, their proportions, and their ratios. Others, of course, spoke to us about the vernacular of individual cities, their urban design choices, their architecture, their spaces, and their places. People spoke to us about the choreography of the city, the acupuncture of the city, the feng shui of the city, and indeed even the homeopathy of the city. These ideas, in a sense, in combined, create a new kind of epistemology of the city, which we found very interesting. Now, we've sought to develop from this way of thinking the idea of the genetic code of the city, 12 different traits that help us to understand what makes each city unique. And we've split these into three groupings. What we might call, firstly, endowed traits, traits that come from the earth, from the physical environment. We've talked then about inherited traits, traits that are created in one cycle of the city's history, but are moved down, inherited by another, expanded and developed. And then we've talked about acquired traits, things that the city has deliberately or purposefully gone about trying to accumulate. So cities accumulate this DNA over time, endowed, inherited, and acquired traits, and cities can more or less leverage the DNA that they have. They can also have epigenetics, scarring, wounds, recovery, regeneration. I'll say a little bit more about that later on. Now, in order to do our study, we decided to look firstly at 12 cities. And those 12 cities are, in a sense, chosen at random, an attempt to represent a little bit of geographic diversity. But our hope is to be able to study many, many more cities over time. The cities we selected are Barcelona, Dubai, Glasgow, Istanbul, London, Philadelphia, New York, Shanghai, Singapore, Sydney, Tel Aviv, and Vienna. And in each of these cities, we've undertaken a kind of investigation into what is the DNA of that individual city. Now, there's no specific science to how we selected the cities we've looked at, but we do hope that they represent an interesting range. When we think about Barcelona, We might begin by observing that this is a city that's constrained by a mountain range, two rivers, and a sea, and therefore it was always destined to become a kind of compact city. Its orientation to the world was always outwards. The sons and daughters of Charlemagne, the Frankish Empire, the Roman city, the medieval city, and then the modern city have always looked beyond the Iberian Peninsula for their sources of inspiration. Barcelona has been called the most northerly city in southern Europe and the most southerly city in northern Europe. It has the ability to combine a Mediterranean lifestyle with Germanic levels of productivity and endeavor. The Manchester of the Mediterranean, as it was called during the industrial era. It's a city where you can dream big. It's a city of large ventures, and it's a city where the social contract is organized around continuous propulsion of the city as a way of improving the quality of life of individual people. Now, many people will be fascinated by the city of Dubai. Dubai's current cycle, where some of the physical manifestations of change have been very large towers, luxury holiday destinations, does not very easily reveal what we've understood to be the underlying personality of the city. You see, Dubai is really a city that's based on innovation and necessity. For 6,000 years, Dubai was a pearling village, a small community of Emiratis capturing pearls and selling them to the world. And it had a unique place in the supply chain of the global pearl system. But in the late 1800s, somebody invented cultured pearls. And suddenly a new form of competition emerged that Dubai had never expected. 6,000 years of settlement and history as a pearling village was somehow disrupted overnight by the arrival of a new technology. So Dubai decided it had to take its future in its own hands. And from a pearling city, it became a fishing village. A fishing village became a port. That port began to promote trade. Before too long, that port needed an airport. The airport brought the possibility of tourism. The airport and tourism created the opportunity for an international business and transport hub as the country needed to diversify its economy. This led to a popular fixation with leisure, tourism, sport, and retail. And suddenly, it's very easy to see that the Dubai that we now see today. But we'd be wrong to conclude that Dubai is simply committed to conspicuous consumption and to tall buildings. Dubai's commitment is to being a city of innovation. And when it hosts the World Expo next year, I believe this will mark the turning point as we see Dubai focus its attention much more on what it will do to spur the next generation of innovation that the world needs. We take the city of Glasgow. When St. Mungo founded his first community in Glasgow in the 7th century as a place of sanctuary for prayer alongside the side of the River Clyde, his 4 miracles, as they were explained, began to unearth the idea of unusual creations being possible in the city. The Clyde creates the perfect setting for a city, as people will know, especially a city that wants to be a launch pad to new worlds. The combination of an Atlantic-facing city with tides, strong winds, and the width of the river made it possible to explore the Atlantic from Glasgow more quickly and more purposely than from any other location. And multiple waves of migration from the rest of Scotland, from Ireland, from England and Wales fueled Glasgow's population. The technological expertise that was derived from the Enlightenment embedded in Scotland with Glasgow's old universities and the new imperatives gave Glasgow a huge phase of innovation. We asked the question, what are Glasgow's greatest inventions? And of course, the steam engine, antiseptic, the cash machine, the fridge, the television, beta blockers, the first police force, ultrasound, and indeed, perhaps last but not least, chicken tikka masala were described as the greatest things that Glasgow has invented through this process. Now, Istanbul has a very particular kind of DNA in the global panoply of cities. Byzantium, Constantinople, Istanbul, the world's first great cosmopolitan city. The idea of a multinational city, a city forged of nationalities willing to come together in a common purpose, firstly as an imperial city, then as a cultural city, a religious city, and a center of exchange. This fusion that Istanbul invented, the idea of the global city, meant that Istanbul was for many centuries the world's desire. Now, London's golden age as an imperial city was visible in 1851. The hosting of the Great Exhibition, where the treasures of the world were exposed for all to see, and the inventions of the British Empire as it then was were laid out for everybody to enjoy, identifies London at a period of its highest level of soft power. London had leveraged the natural advantages of the Thames, of wind and sea and tide, to become a great global port and to become an imperial city. Building upon the great deal that was done in 1067 between William the Conqueror and the city fathers in London, whereby a negotiated freedom was provided. In return for loyalty to the king, the City of London's merchants would be allowed, as they had established, freedom of trade, freedom of thought, freedom of association, and freedom of belief. And this negotiated freedom set in train in London a huge outpouring of creative, scientific, and discovery endeavor. And London's sheer size meant that it was able to take inventions from other parts of the world and scale them up. Now, Philadelphia, the city that invented America, also became a great city of social reforms. Libraries, medicines, schools, housing, welfare, fire brigades were all invented in Philadelphia for the first time. When Donald Trump said in the first presidential debate that bad things happen in Philadelphia recently, people of Philadelphia fought back with a T-shirt that listed 20 of the greatest things that Philadelphia has produced, including the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution. Philadelphia is above all a city of conscience, a city in which care and caring for one's fellow humans, the city of brotherly love, is at the heart of everything that the city does. Now, I've spoken very briefly, Andrew, about 6 of the cities that we've been studying. And of course, there's 6 more. New York, where the spirit of enterprise was in a sense implanted from Amsterdam. Shanghai, the Pacific city that invented Chinese communism. Singapore, the little red dot that signifies the corner of ASEAN and its connection to the world. Sydney, with its amazing outdoor lifestyle, building upon 60,000 years of settlement by the Gadigal people and the Eora nation, becoming Australia's great global gateway. Tel Aviv, the city that combines 2 ideas, the ancient trading port of Jaffa, one of the great Arabian cities in the circuit of trade in the Middle East and the Mediterranean, with the city that was dreamed about for 3,000 years by the Jewish people, one day that they would have a Hebrew-speaking city that they could call their own. And of course, Vienna. If Philadelphia invented America, then Vienna in certain ways invented everything we know and understand to be Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburgs, led to a city of mass invention that saw new music, art, medicine, psychiatry, political philosophy, and so much more be invented. But Vienna also shows us the challenge, if you like, of the epigenetics of the city. During World War II and the Third Reich, Vienna lost its Jewish population, and that enfeebled the city in all sorts of ways, from which it's still seeking a long-term recovery. So there's so much more that I could say on any one day about all of these cities. But let's go back to what we mean then by the genetic code of the city. In our studies of all of these cities, I said firstly that we identified 3 endowed elements of the code. The first of these are physical, the topography, the geology, the geography of the city that gives it its shape, gives its relationships with waters and winds and sun. It's important opportunities to promote trade, to find settlement, and creating the intention to build new infrastructure. The second of these endowed traits is climate, ecology, the carrying capacity of the city, its ability to service populations with food, with water, and with other kinds of substances required for human life. And then the third element of the DNA of the city seems to be location, its neighbors. Who is it close to and who is it far from? What are the tendencies of those who it has proximity with, and how does it interact with them? So these three endowed traits seem in every city to set the scene for what then happens next. And then we identified these inherited traits, traits, if you like, that are passed from one cycle to another. Of course, part of this is the continuous history of the city, the shocks that it experiences, the way it responds to those shocks, the catalysts that arrive, the things that forge new moments in the journey of the city, new points, new chapters, and new pathways. The other inherited elements include, of course, infrastructure, land uses, and connectivity. Anyone who lives in a city that was once a Roman city will be very familiar with the ongoing shaping effect of the Roman roads. And then the sixth inherited trait, of course, is the architecture, the design, the vernacular, the sense in which the city has a character that's to do with how human beings and the built environment interact. We can also observe perhaps a seventh version of this, that the city establishes trade relationships, connections, urban system relationships. Cities that are the first city in an urban system are different to the cities that are second or third in the urban system in the dynamics of the city and the way they behave. Capital cities are different to port cities. And we notice in particular the ways in which this set of relationships with places beyond the city border begins to affect not just the dynamic of how the city thinks, but who is there and what kind of population is attracted. And then we can identify perhaps 5 traits that are acquired. Some cities set out to do these intentionally, or they acquire them perhaps by accident of history. The first of these, of course, is to do with people and culture. It's to do with migration. It's to do with social mix. It's to do with the different kinds of versions of humanity that end up in the city, the cultural production that they're engaged with, and the cross-cultural exchange that occurs. In nearly all of the cities that we've studied, migration has been a critical dimension in how the city has emerged and how its chemistry has changed. Of course, institutions and governance are key aspects of the DNA of the city. How the city is managed and organized, its operating system in our current speak, is very important. And this leads on, of course, to the innovations and discoveries, the things where the city has been able to implant its footprint on the rest of the world, the innovations that have enabled the city to make rapid social or economic progress, or the things that have enabled the city to discover and build new markets for its products and its ideas. Beyond this, we identify 2 other kinds of aspects or traits of the acquired DNA of the city. The first of these is behaviors, systems, and patterns. Every city seems to have an individual way of going about its business, particularly how it goes about its business on a weekday or a weekend, what it does when there's a crisis, how it celebrates its festivals, and how it augments that behavior with systems that then shape people's lives. Any city that has an underground railway understands very well that the underground railway plays a critical role in how behavior is synchronized and systematically organized within the city. And then the 12th of the traits that we've been able to identify is mindset, attitude, agreements, soft power, if you like, the social contract of the city and how it changes the psychology of the city, how people think about the city and their attitudes towards people elsewhere, and how they organize. Now, these 12 traits of the DNA of the city are the ideas that we've been using to begin to look into this notion of urban identity and how to decode it. And of course, it's been fascinating to do this so far. And I spoke earlier on about how important it is for us now to balance this inside out way of looking at the city with outside in ways of thinking about the cities that involve counting. We spoke to many, many people about why it is that this idea of the DNA of the city may be useful or important. For some people, Andrew, the DNA of cities is a kind of metaphor. It's not really a literal thing. It's the idea that a genetic code could exist and that we would be able to pursue it and explore it that they find fascinating. For other people, the DNA of cities is a literal thing, identifying a hard substructure to the city that affects and influences everything that happens in the city over time. But all people who we've spoken to really agree about 5 things. Firstly, people say that the idea of the DNA of cities is very important for building identity, for creating a sense of affinity, of pride, of belonging, of association with the city. In a world in which alienation is so rife, the idea that DNA can help us to create a sense of belonging for large numbers of people and to build an identity and a visibility that is clear is worthwhile, people tell us. And for these reasons, the DNA of cities is a very popular concept in city branding and in other things like that. The second thing that people tell us, though, is that the DNA of cities is very important for understanding the latent capacity, the carrying capacity, if you like, of the city. As cities grow rapidly and populations change, and the economic functions that they need to house evolve, we need to understand what cities can do, and importantly, what they can't do without further assistance. The DNA of cities helps us to foresee what, as it were, is the mathematical potential of the city in terms of what it can accommodate and what it can't, and when and how it will need to adjust. The third example is very important at the moment as we face COVID-19. People tell us that thinking about the DNA of cities is a good way to understand how the city will respond to shocks, how it will adjust, what it will do in the face of conflict, trauma, and difficulty, and how the city will emerge subsequently. What will be, as it were, the medium and long term ways that it will adjust to crises, with many cities having proven many times in history that crises are simply moments of extreme innovation. And then the fourth reason that people like this idea of the DNA of cities is that it makes it possible to have a different kind of conversation about the city, especially in cities where one population has supplanted another. Cities that have been colonies, for example, or cities that have been imperial in their nature. A real conversation about the DNA of Sydney or of Philadelphia or of New York or of Glasgow is a way to engage in a new kind of reconciliation in thinking about who the city really belongs to and who it's really for. And then lastly, people talk about the DNA of cities as being a helpful way to reformulate the social contract of the city. The idea that the people must give their tacit agreement to the way in which the city is organized, what it tries to do, and how it works. So these 5 activities overlap. We have found them particularly interesting in thinking about why the DNA of cities is a useful concept. And if we think about this directly, much more attention has been paid to number 1, using the DNA of cities as it was as a way to sell the city, rather than thinking about how the DNA of cities can be used to provoke a new reconciliation, to build a new social contract, to understand the capacity of the city, and to work much harder on thinking about how the city will deal with shocks. So let's spend one moment talking about the shock that we're now in, COVID-19. We don't have time to do justice to the idea of COVID-19 and cities in a few short moments as part of a keynote. But let me simply say that I think it's important to view how COVID-19 affects cities with three different time horizons in mind. The first of these time horizons is, of course, what's happening right now, the immediate attempts to manage the pandemic in cities and to adjust the cities to the need to be healthy and to be secure. The second phase will be when cities, in a sense, are able to reopen, when the medical emergency has ceased, but when the changed behaviors and the carried behaviors from cycle one will still be visible, and we'll see how the city adjusts to that. And then the third phase will be in the longer term when cities accommodate themselves much more to the changed behaviors that have occurred. When we look at COVID-19, I see six very particular emergent forces of change that have emerged as a result of this, that I think will be part of how cities will change in the second phase as we move away from the medical crisis and into the period of reformulation. Very quickly, I think they're to do with changed trade and supply systems, the need to focus much more on resilience than on efficiency. I think they're to do with a supercharged digitization process, which changes both business models and the way in which people consume all sorts of things, from education and entertainment to consumer products, and of course, the way people work. The third one is, of course, the revealed inadequacies and inequalities within our healthcare systems and the vulnerabilities of our different populations towards this kind of pandemic. The fourth one is the relationship between human health and planetary health, which has been underlined by COVID-19, creating a great new imperative either to build back better or to have a green recovery. The fifth one is the changed relationship between citizens and nation states as governments have become much more pervasive in people's lives. And indeed, there's been a retreat towards competitive nationalism and away from multilateralism. And then the sixth one has been the drive for a for a revised social contract based much more on the neighborliness, the philanthropy, fiscal fairness, and other kinds of things that have emerged as great ideas during this pandemic. Now, the effect of these things together is that in the medium term, cities will have to change the way they're organized. But none of these things seem to me to be able to forecast the end of the city. There will, of course, be challenges about jobs, and there will be alarm about how cities react to these things. But in the medium term, cities must adjust. And one of the ways they'll adjust, in my view, is that COVID-19 will be seen to have been an accelerator of the new shapes and sizes of cities that were already emerging during our century of the city. You see, as we got to this fourth, fifth, and then sixth decade of the century, we were already beginning to see multi-centered cities, to see multi-city regions, to see corridors, to see connected places, to see more population growing in smaller cities and towns that were accessible to larger cities, to move, as it were, away from the single city being important to the system of cities and places being the critical way of organizing. And COVID-19 has, in a sense, accelerated this by focusing our attention on what happens when we combine the physical city with the virtual city that's been accelerated. And in this regard, we might begin to emerge that we're leading more hybrid lives, more agile lives, more blended lives, perhaps emerging into a kind of blended city, where people make a different set of decisions about where they live, how they work, and how they consume, and in particular when they travel. And this creates new opportunities to reforge the way housing markets and labor markets combine, but also to think more about our cities less as places of work and much more of places of consumption, of creativity, of invention, and of discovery. So as we think about the DNA of cities and we think about COVID-19, the idea of the DNA of cities provides us, I think, with multiple insights about how cities may emerge in the second and third phases of this pandemic. One observation I would make very clearly is that it's clear from everything that's happened so far that COVID-19 has unleashed a wave of what we might call anti-city opinion. It's easy to read in the media and to hear on the news the death of the city, the end of the city, the creation of ghost towns, the arrival, as it were, of the end of the city centre, and everything else. But our other imperatives, equality, climate change, productivity, the generation of resources, require us to think about how we can make our cities good. And there are many opportunities for us to do that as we think about the second and third cycles that will emerge. So, coming to my final comment, let me say something about why the DNA of cities has become an interesting idea for me. You see, it's not just that every city has this individual genetic code, as it were, that allows us to perceive it as an individual city and to balance in our minds the outside in of cities that allows us to compare many hundreds of cities using comparable data sets where we can compare and contrast how they perform and learn from that. But there is also this inside out way of understanding cities, to look at the history, the geography, the anthropology, the biochemistry of the city, and begin to understand what makes each city unique and to hold that in our minds. Now, one of the reasons this is so important is that by thinking about cities in this way, cities enliven the senses. It reminds us that we don't just see the city, we also smell the city, we hear the city, we breathe the city, we can dream the city. And the individual cities that we've discussed and have studied in this area of activity that we're going to publish on soon have each reminded us that for many individuals, it's the ability of the city to help human beings to dream something different, something to do with freedom, something to do with innovation, something to do with collective action, and something to do with synchronizing human progress. That means that as we think about what happens to cities after COVID-19, and we think about our world, we will need cities more, much more than ever before. Thank you.
We've got a short time for some reflections and some questions. I wanted to pick up on two aspects that you talked about through your talk. And the first one is around the notion, the concept of DNA and the DNA of cities. And then you talked a little bit about these kind of three groupings of different traits. Say something more about how do they interrelate? Where are some more important than others at given points in a city's cycle? We know path dependency history matters in the sense of where cities have been and where they're going. Are there some bounds in the sense of where cities can get to? We all hear cities want to be world class, they want to be leading X, they want to be leading in Y. But do we need a more mindful and more realistic perspective of what cities can achieve?
Yes, well, in a way, Andrew, that's the core message that comes out of this, that if you like, every city has to learn how to be itself. Right, which is much more important than cities wanting to copy other cities and become more like them. Each city has to look at its own particular endowment, its inheritance, its ability to acquire new traits, and to think about that in a much more thoughtful and intelligent way. And I would argue that there's more richness in that way of thinking than there is in simply trying to develop a kind of copycat approach. So path dependency, I think, is very real. But what we've seen by looking at the cities that we've studied is that, of course, paths have changed through shocks, through external activities that none expected. Jaffa did not expect to have Tel Aviv built next to it and for suddenly there to be a twin city function and then a large metropolitan area. Vienna did not anticipate the Third Reich and the Second World War. So there are all sorts of ways in which cities can best prepare themselves for shocks by understanding what their underlying DNA is and what their capabilities are. Now, the first bit of your question is about the relationship between these things. We've tried in very simple ways to say, look, there's an endowment that comes from Mother Earth, as it were. Then there are things that are inherited from one generation to another. Then there are things that are acquired either deliberately or accidentally because of a particular kind of shock. Now, of course, the things that are acquired also become an inheritance for future generations. But it's the accumulated nature of these elements of the DNA that adds up to something. And I think you're right to observe that at different points in the city's history or the path it's on, different things may be important. So, for example, as Sydney thinks today about how it's going to manage its population growth and shift from a city, as it were, of one city to a metropolis of three cities, some very important ideas from the Eora Nation and the Gadigal tribe become important about thinking about city as an outdoor city, thinking about Sydney as a place where people are free to roam, thinking about Sydney's breadbasket, its basin qualities, its place of habitat. So these ideas can also inspire thinking about how to promote change today in a very different environment.
And that relates to the second point I wanted to pick up with you, which is this almost, you look across these cities and obviously your work more generally, the imperative to change, the imperative to act, the imperative to organize. Where does it come from? How does it manifest itself? How does it become organized? Can we see traits and attributes in different cities about how that interest, that need to react, that need to act comes from different industries, different sectors, different institutions?
Well, I think over time, looking at the cities we've looked at, of course, a lot of this has been associated with empires, it's been associated with trade, it's been associated with military conquest, it's been associated with colonization, or it's been associated with great periods of intellectual endeavor, fin de siècle, Vienna, Glasgow during the Enlightenment. These are very interesting phases and times. But really, the impulses here come from the people within the city and their collective idea. When we think about Barcelona and we think about what happened at the end of the Franco regime in 74, when the leaders of the city decided that, for the Catalan people, there was a need to remake the city, that Barcelona is as it were, the emblem of Catalanism in the urban form. They had to reach back to this historical DNA they had of looking outwards to the world, being productive, wanting to focus on being the most northerly city in the south and the most southerly city of the north. And around that, you can build a social contract, you can build a consensus around the city as a project and what it needs to do next. So it's very important, I think, in the soft power and the social contract of the city to use this kind of language or insight to build coalitions for change. Cities can't move forward if they are stuck in fractured agendas, whereby there's an equal and opposite reaction to every idea that's put forward.
Yeah, I think I agree. And there's a real strong sense that notwithstanding those challenges, we can observe and see cities that have been deliberate and deliberative about the way that they move forward.
Yes, some cities have had periods of great intentionality. Shanghai today is one of the most intentional cities you will ever come across. Shanghai today wants to be recognized as one of the world's top 10 cities. It's probably already there. It knows that it needs to be China's global city, China's global business, intellectual and cultural hub, and it has a deliberate program to do that. But as Shanghai does that, it is reaching back into its periods, in the 19th century and in the 18th century, when it was already a cosmopolitan and international city. And it's reaching back before that into its period as a great port city of the Pacific Ocean. Shanghai is, in a certain sense, a Pacific city before it's a Chinese city. And so it's reaching back into this DNA, as it were, to propel itself forward and to make its proposition logical and coherent and consistent.
So I wanted to pick up another point that you raise in your talk, and to bring it literally to the here and the now. I mean, you talked in your presentation about we're in the middle of a metropolitan century.
Yeah.
You talked about cities being humankind's kind of greatest invention. And yet we're having this conversation precisely at a moment where a pandemic has come along that's really challenged, or some would have us believe, has really challenged the idea and the premise of cities, not just individual cities, but cities themselves as a construct and an idea. And I wondered, given your very unique global perspective, just give us your thoughts on how this sort of debate, as it currently is evolving and developing, varies when we look across the globe. I mean, how are the North Americans talking about the pandemic and the future of cities? How are the Europeans? How are the Asians? I mean, what would be your kind of reflections on that? And what does it tell us about the role of cities more generally in civilization?
Well, it's a really good question, Andrew. And of course, it goes without saying that, in the history of cities and pandemics are forces of innovation. And nearly every city that's had a pandemic has adjusted to that, has improved everything from water and sanitation to housing to health. These things have been triggers for innovation, and the cities have evolved again from that. And I see no reason why this pandemic should be any different in any way. What I do think we're observing in the global media at the moment is a kind of very short-term perspective, and perhaps a short anecdote about this. 3 weeks ago, I connected with a whole group of colleagues in New York. And as you know, if you read the media coming out of New York at the moment, the prediction of, New York being a ghost town, the cities are dead, the end of the CBD, Manhattan will never come back again. These ideas are rife everywhere. And I spoke to colleagues in New York. Every single one of them was not within the 5 boroughs of New York. Some of them were on a ranch in Texas. Others were at a holiday home in Florida. Others were way out in a cottage on Long Island. Some of them were further away. In the same week, I spoke to as many colleagues as I could find in Shanghai. All of them were back in the office, and all of them were working normally. They were taking high levels of precaution. They were not being cavalier. They were all wearing masks. They were all sanitizing regularly. They were carefully sequencing their ridership on the underground system, but they were all back in the office. And it occurred to me to observe kind of 2 or 3 really, I think, interesting things from that. One, urbanization in China is at a different point from urbanization in America, where people really need the city in a very particular way, and they really want the city to work. On the other hand, I think that, in America, they've been, in a certain sense, post-city for some time, even though their economy very much depends on city. But I think there are also some habits here that are interesting. In America, there have been long periods over the last 40, 50 years when the middle class or the more mobile have fled the city because it's a place of risk. You've had the experience of white flight, suburbanization, the building up of car-dependent exurbs and suburbs and everything else. In Shanghai and in China more generally, there's been a focus on planned mass urbanization and, in a sense, making good the city, making the city a good place to be as part of a national project to take, 500 million and ultimately 1 billion people out of poverty. So whereas the American instinct is at the moment, I think, to flee something that seems dangerous, the Chinese instinct is very quickly to make good and make safe and try to manage it in a different way. So you're seeing some cultural differences. So the news that we see around the world prophesying the death of the city, I think, well, firstly, I think it's wrong. But secondly, I think it perhaps reflects just a short-term perspective that's happening, particularly in North America. In Europe, I think it's very different. The discourse that's happening in Europe in the moment is very much about adjusting the city to the post-COVID world. We're thinking much more about opening up public spaces for citizens, much more about walking and cycling and active transport, much more about the multi-centered metropolitan area and the opportunity of COVID actually for, neighborhood vitality and creating town centers that are much more full service and omni-channel. So I think the conversation is going in a different direction.
So much more that we could talk about, but we need to bring this session to a close. I'd like to thank our speaker today, Professor Greg Clark. Such a rich and fascinating discussion and talk, with leaving us with lots to consider. Greg, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Andrew.